Imagine this, it's the middle of the 20th century. The Western world is charging full speed into the age of science, industry, and logic. Everything is being measured, categorized, and explained. Success means control, progress means acceleration, and the mind is treated like a machine that can be perfected through reason alone. Yet, in the middle of this storm of ideas, a quiet Japanese scholar begins to speak about something entirely different. Silence, awareness, and the art of doing nothing. His name is Daisetsu Teitaro Suzuki. He was not a monk hidden away in a mountain temple. He was a professor, a writer, a translator. But what he brought across the ocean would quietly shift the way Western thinkers understood the mind, consciousness, and even reality itself. This man did not come to preach religion. He came to explain a way of seeing the world. Suzuki's mission was not to convert, but to translate. The Japan he came from was steeped in Zen, a form of Buddhism that valued experience over belief, silence over sermons, direct insight over dogma. Zen monks did not argue about truth. They sat in meditation until they saw it. But to a Western audience shaped by centuries of analytical philosophy and Christian theology, this seemed alien. How could enlightenment come from just sitting still? How could silence teach anything? Suzuki took it upon himself to answer that question in a way that Western minds could understand. Born in 1870 in Kanazawa, Japan, D.T. Suzuki grew up during a period of cultural upheaval. Japan was opening to the West for the first time in centuries, and the country was wrestling with how to integrate foreign science and philosophy without losing its soul. Suzuki studied both. He learned English and immersed himself in Western thought, while also training under Zen masters. He experienced Satori, the flash of enlightenment, firsthand. That experience became the core of his teaching. Enlightenment is not an idea. It's an experience that transforms perception. It cannot be studied from the outside. It must be lived. When Suzuki began writing about Zen for Western audiences, his challenge was enormous. How do you explain something that by nature resists explanation? Western philosophy valued logic and structure. Zen valued paradox and emptiness. Suzuki's genius was that he didn't simplify Zen. He made it speak English without losing its mystery. He used language that philosophers, psychologists, and artists could grasp. He spoke of direct experience, of seeing into one's own nature, and of living without separation between self and world. These phrases became bridges between two mental worlds. Suzuki's writings reached the West at the perfect time. The early 20th century was a period of intellectual hunger. The horrors of two world wars had left many Western thinkers questioning the limits of reason. Philosophers, writers, and psychologists were searching for meaning beyond analysis. When Suzuki began lecturing at Columbia University in the 1950s, his ideas found fertile ground. He spoke calmly, without theatrics, yet his words landed like quiet explosions in the minds of his listeners. His students were not just academics, they were poets, musicians, and future cultural icons. One of those listeners was the composer John Cage. Cage was fascinated by the idea of silence as music, a concept that came directly from Suzuki's Zen. He began to see that sound, even random noise, was not separate from silence. It was part of the same whole. This insight led to one of the most famous pieces in modern music, 433, a composition where the performer does nothing for 4 minutes and 33 seconds. The music is the sound of the environment itself, the audience breathing, the rustle of seats, the hum of life. That radical idea was pure Zen, refracted through the quiet influence of Suzuki. Artists like Mark Tobey and writers like Jack Kerouac and Alan Watts were also drawn to Suzuki's teachings. They found in Zen an antidote to the modern sickness of overthinking. The Beat Generation, which emerged in the 1950s, wore Suzuki's ideas like armor against conformity. They wrote about spontaneous living, about being present, about breaking free from the machinery of thought, all ideas that echoed through Suzuki's translations of Zen masters. Without raising his voice, Suzuki became the philosophical grandfather of a countercultural movement. Yet, what made Suzuki truly revolutionary was not that he inspired artists, it was that he subtly changed the way Western psychology understood the human mind. Before Suzuki, Western psychology, but especially Freudian thought, treated the mind as a system of conflicts, desires versus morality, ego versus ID. The goal was to manage or analyze these tensions. Suzuki, however, presented a different model, one where the mind was not a battlefield, but a mirror. The task was not to fix the mind, but to see it clearly, without judgment. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst, met Suzuki in 1939. Their meeting left a mark on Jung's understanding of consciousness. Jung realized that the self was not just a collection of memories and instincts, it was something deeper, something that could awaken to its own nature through silence and awareness. Suzuki's calm demeanor concealed the depth of his influence. He did not look like a revolutionary. He wore glasses, spoke softly, and lectured with precision. But his presence radiated the confidence of someone who had seen beyond the surface of things. To his students, he embodied the very essence of Zen, not as a doctrine, but as a way of being. When asked to define Zen, he often refused. He said, "Zen cannot be explained. If it could, it would not be Zen." Yet through his refusal, he explained everything. To understand Suzuki's impact, imagine a classroom in the 1950s at Columbia University. The air hums with tension between tradition and rebellion. Students expect a lecture filled with quotes and arguments. Instead, Suzuki begins with silence. He waits. Minutes pass, the silence stretches until it becomes uncomfortable, then transforming into something else, awareness. Only then does he speak, gently pointing out that this awareness, this stillness, is what Zen means by awakening. No argument, no persuasion, just direct experience. Suzuki's books, like essays in Zen Buddhism and an introduction to Zen Buddhism, became entry points for thousands of readers seeking meaning beyond material progress. His writing had a clarity that came from lived understanding. He didn't describe Zen as exotic or mystical. He described it as practical, a way to wake up from the dream of constant striving. To him, enlightenment was not an escape from life, it was returning fully to it. He wrote that the purpose of Zen is to see into the heart of things, to live in such a way that there is no gap between thinking and being. By the time Suzuki passed away in 1966, his ideas had already seeped into the roots of Western culture. Meditation centers began appearing in cities. Psychologists started studying mindfulness as therapy. Artists and philosophers spoke of presence and flow. Even corporate leaders would, decades later, borrow his language to describe clarity and purpose. What began as a few quiet lectures had become a revolution of perception. Suzuki never called himself a guru. He disliked the idea of spiritual authority. He saw himself as a translator, someone who carried ideas across the bridge between East and West. Yet what he translated was more than philosophy. He translated silence itself. He showed that in a world addicted to thought, the most radical act is to stop thinking for a moment and simply be. And that's why D.T. Suzuki remains one of the most quietly powerful figures of the modern age. Without ever founding a movement, he created one. Without ever raising his voice, he changed how millions understand consciousness. He proved that wisdom doesn't need noise to be heard, it only needs clarity. So if you've ever sat still for a few minutes watching your breath, trying to find peace in the middle of chaos, you're walking a path Suzuki helped build. He brought the mountain silence of Zen into the heart of modern life. And maybe, without even realizing it, you've already been touched by his work. If you found value in this story, make sure to like, comment, And subscribe to The Fictionist, where we bring the unseen forces behind history's most transformative minds to life. When D.T. Suzuki's writings began circulating through the West after World War II, they landed in a culture that was in many ways exhausted. The war had shattered the illusion of progress that had defined the early 20th century. Science and reason, once celebrated as humanity, as saviors, had also produced atomic bombs and mechanized killing on an unimaginable scale. The old religious frameworks, especially in Europe and America, were losing their authority, leaving behind a spiritual vacuum. Into this void came Suzuki's voice, measured, calm, and profoundly different. He didn't offer salvation or belief, he offered experience. His message was simple yet radical. You don't find truth by thinking about it, you find it by seeing. In the aftermath of the war, the West was filled with people questioning not only morality and politics, but the very foundations of consciousness. Intellectuals and artists were searching for something that could explain existence without the baggage of guilt or doctrine. Psychology was moving from Freud's model of conflict toward humanistic ideas about potential and self-realization. Existential philosophers were exploring meaning in a meaningless world. In that restless landscape, Suzuki's essays in Zen Buddhism struck like a quiet thunderclap. He described a way of perceiving that was not bound by logic, religion, or ideology. He described Zen as a discipline, not of belief, but of awareness. Suzuki wrote that Zen training is about seeing into one's own nature. That phrase became almost a mantra among Western thinkers who felt trapped by their own analytical minds. He emphasized that Zen was not a philosophy to be studied, but a practice to be lived. The reader could not understand Zen by reading about it any more than they could understand swimming by studying physics. They had to dive in. This focus on direct experience made Zen especially appealing to the new wave of psychologists and intellectuals who were growing frustrated with abstract theory. By the 1950s, Suzuki's ideas had begun to infiltrate American universities. His lectures at Columbia University were not packed with mystics or monks. They were filled with professors, writers, musicians, and scientists. These were people who had built their lives on words, yet they were captivated by a philosophy that began with silence. Suzuki described Zen as a liberation from the tyranny of words and logic. For a generation raised on logic, that was liberating. To understand why his ideas resonated so deeply, you have to picture the cultural climate. The West was rebuilding its cities and economies, but spiritually it was still in ruins. The Cold War was beginning, the threat of nuclear annihilation hung in the air, and people were starting to realize that technological progress had not brought inner peace. In fact, it had made the world louder and more chaotic. Suzuki's Zen appeared as an antidote, a medicine for the overactive mind. It wasn't an escape from the world, but a way to meet it without being crushed by it. Artists were among the first to respond. Painters like Mark Tobey and Franz Klein found in Zen a new way to think about creativity, not as control, but as surrender. In Zen calligraphy, the brushstroke is not planned, it flows from the moment. That idea that the best art comes from an empty mind rather than a busy one deeply influenced abstract expressionism. The artist was no longer the master, but the instrument of expression. This mirrored Zen's core insight. Enlightenment is not about becoming special. It's about realizing you were never separate from the universe to begin with. Writers followed suit. The Beat Generation, figures like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and Gary Snyder, absorbed Suzuki's teachings and turned them into a cultural movement. They were rebelling against conformity, materialism, and the emotional sterility of post-war America. Suzuki gave them a vocabulary for rebellion that wasn't angry or political, it was inward. His explanation of Satori, the flash of insight that comes when the mind stops seeking, became a metaphor for artistic inspiration. Kerouac's spontaneous writing style, Ginsberg's stream of consciousness poetry, and Snyder's nature-centered prose all carry traces of Suzuki's Zen. But it wasn't only artists who listened. Psychologists and philosophers began to see that Suzuki's ideas offered something Western science had overlooked, the unity of mind and body. While the West had divided the two for centuries, Zen treated them as one. Awareness was not in the brain or the soul, it was in the act of living. This view quietly reshaped modern psychology. Carl Jung had already encountered Suzuki before the war and recognized in Zen a form of self-realization that went beyond analysis. Later, humanistic psychologists like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers built their theories of peak experience and self-actualization on similar ground. Without quoting Suzuki directly, they echoed his message. Fulfillment comes not from fixing the self, but from seeing through the illusion that the self is separate from life. Suzuki's timing could not have been more perfect. He was introducing Zen just as Western thinkers were beginning to question their deepest assumptions about identity and control. His lectures and essays arrived in English precisely when translation wasn't just linguistic, it was cultural. People were ready to hear that freedom wasn't something to be achieved, but something to be noticed. There was also something distinctly modern in Suzuki's tone. Unlike traditional religious teachers, he didn't demand reverence. He didn't threaten damnation or promise paradise. He spoke with intellectual precision, but carried the authority of lived experience. When he described meditation, it wasn't as ritual, it was as training. He explained that sitting in silence is like polishing a mirror. You remove the dust of thought until the mind reflects reality exactly as it is. This practical, methodical framing made Zen attractive to people who might have rejected spirituality outright. Suzuki showed them that enlightenment was not mystical, it was psychological clarity. Even the word mindfulness, which dominates Western culture today, owes its popularity to the soil Suzuki helped cultivate. While he didn't invent the term, he set the stage for its acceptance. He normalized the idea that consciousness could be trained. He introduced meditation as something anyone could do, not just monks. That simple shift changed everything. Meditation stopped being a religious act and became a human one. It is also worth noting that Suzuki was careful not to present Zen as an escape from Western thought, but as a complement to it. He often compared Zen to science. Just as science studies the external world by observation, Zen studies the internal world through awareness. The goal of both, he argued, is the same: to see things as they are. This comparison made Zen respectable in academic circles. It wasn't superstition, it was inquiry. And slowly, Western thinkers began to realize that the modern crisis, the anxiety, the alienation, the restlessness, was not going to be solved by more information or technology. It was a problem of perception. Suzuki offered a solution that didn't require changing the world, only how one saw it. He wrote, "When the mind is quiet, everything falls into place." For a culture drowning in noise, that line was revolutionary. By the late 1950s, Zen had become more than an exotic curiosity. It had become part of the Western vocabulary. You could find Zen referenced in literature, art, psychology, and even physics. The idea that the observer and the observed were connected, central to both Zen and quantum theory, fascinated scientists like Werner Heisenberg and Niels Bohr. They began to see parallels between Eastern mysticism and modern physics, a conversation Suzuki helped spark by reframing Zen not as superstition, but as a philosophy of perception. Through his work, Suzuki planted a seed in the Western mind. That seed would grow into a vast cultural movement that redefined how the West understood thought, emotion, and awareness. He didn't preach revolution. He wrote quietly, precisely, and consistently. Yet his words carried the weight of centuries of wisdom. They told a civilization obsessed with control that true clarity comes from letting go. Suzuki once wrote, "Zen in its essence is the art of seeing into the nature of one's being, and it points the way from bondage to freedom." Those words could have been written for the entire post-war world, a world bound by fear, guilt, and confusion, searching desperately for release. His message wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore. It said, in effect, that the mind's liberation doesn't depend on changing history or fixing society. It begins with sitting still and seeing clearly. And in that stillness, Suzuki offered something the modern world had forgotten: peace, not as an achievement, but as a realization. When the Beat Generation emerged in 1950s America, they were not just a group of writers and poets. They were a generation trying to breathe in a world that felt suffocating. The war was over, but conformity had replaced chaos. Suburbia was spreading, television was taking over homes, and every aspect of life seemed to be built around the same promise: security, success, and silence. But this silence wasn't the kind D.T. Suzuki wrote about. It wasn't the silence of the mind or the calm of awareness. It was the silence of repression, of voices forced to fit into neat, acceptable patterns. Against that backdrop, Suzuki's ideas arrived like an open window. He didn't intend to be a revolutionary. He was an elderly scholar who wrote quietly about Zen Buddhism, but his words reached a generation ready to break free. For the Beats, Suzuki's Zen was not an academic topic. It was a weapon against the dullness of modern life. His description of Satori, the sudden flash of enlightenment that comes without warning, felt to them like the perfect metaphor for artistic inspiration. His emphasis on spontaneity and presence mirrored their yearning to live fully in the moment, not in a world of 9-to-5 jobs and social expectations. Jack Kerouac, the restless wanderer of American literature, found in Suzuki's work a philosophy that justified his impulsive way of living. In On the Road, he tried to capture the rhythm of life as it happened, without editing, without censorship. That was pure Zen. Suzuki wrote that when the mind stops clinging to structure, truth reveals itself naturally. Kerouac translated that into art. He called it spontaneous prose. He believed that real creativity could only happen when thought stopped trying to control experience. In that sense, he was describing a literary version of Zazen, sitting meditation translated into movement and language. Allen Ginsberg, the poet whose words would ignite cultural revolutions, saw something similar in Suzuki's teachings. Ginsberg's poem Howl was a cry against the mechanical soul of post-war America. It was raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. He later said that Zen helped him understand that poetry was not about crafting an image, but about expressing direct experience. Suzuki had written that Zen has no patience for artificiality. Truth, he said, is found in what is immediate, not what is polished. That insight became the heartbeat of the Beat movement. Gary Snyder, the quietest of the group, perhaps understood Suzuki the best. Snyder actually studied Zen seriously, even living in Japan to train under real monks. For him, Suzuki wasn't just a philosopher. He was a translator of an entire way of being. Snyder saw Zen as a bridge between humanity and nature, between mind and body. His poems, often spare and clear, reflected the same economy of language found in Zen writings. Where Kerouac burned with energy and Ginsberg howled in rage, Snyder breathed. His simplicity was not ignorance, it was awareness. What made Suzuki so vital to these artists wasn't that he gave them a belief system, it was that he gave them permission to question everything, including belief itself. He stripped away the religious trappings and presented Zen as a direct encounter with reality. In a society obsessed with definitions and labels, that was subversive. When Suzuki said that enlightenment cannot be taught or defined, he was saying that truth cannot be institutionalized. To the Beats, that was everything. It was a spiritual rebellion that didn't need slogans or manifestos. It just needed awareness. Imagine America in the 1950s. The streets are filled with cars that all look the same. The news broadcasts optimism and prosperity. But beneath it, there's restlessness. Young people are realizing that material comfort doesn't bring meaning. The universities are teaching reason and logic, but students are yearning for something more visceral. Into that environment walks D.T. Suzuki, a soft-spoken man in his 80s, giving lectures about nothingness, awareness, and the sound of one hand clapping. And somehow that made perfect sense. Suzuki never tried to attract attention, yet his writings quietly infiltrated coffee houses, dorm rooms, and underground poetry readings. The Beats passed his books around like sacred texts. Essays in Zen Buddhism became a kind of underground Bible, not because it preached salvation, but because it refused to preach at all. Suzuki's voice carried the weight of ancient wisdom, yet it didn't demand submission. He told his readers that truth is not found in authority figures, churches, or governments. It's found in the moment you stop searching. Kerouac once wrote that the only people for him were the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live. Suzuki might not have used the word mad, but he would have understood the sentiment. Zen is not about being calm and detached from life. It's about being fully present in it. When you drink tea, just drink tea. When you walk, just walk. That kind of total engagement resonated with the Beats' desire to feel life in its rawest form. They didn't want to escape reality. They wanted to taste it completely without filters. Suzuki showed them how. What's remarkable is how Suzuki's influence extended beyond literature. His ideas helped create an entire cultural shift. The Beat generation wasn't just about poetry, it was the seed of the 1960s counterculture. The openness to Eastern philosophy, meditation, and even psychedelic exploration all traced their roots to the Beats' fascination with Zen. Suzuki's emphasis on direct experience inspired them to explore consciousness in every possible way. Some took it literally through meditation. Others, like Ginsberg, sought it through expanded states of mind. Whether through stillness or chaos, they were chasing the same insight Suzuki described, the realization that awareness is already complete. This connection between Zen and art was not accidental. Suzuki explained that Zen is, at its core, creative. It is the art of seeing clearly, and that clarity naturally expresses itself in creation. He wrote about the Zen artist who paints a bamboo stalk, not from observation but from unity with it. The artist becomes the bamboo. The brush moves without thought. That same principle guided the Beats. When Kerouac wrote in a frenzy, typing without pause, he wasn't being careless. He was practicing a kind of literary meditation. Each word was a breath, unplanned and alive. The paradox of Suzuki's influence is that he never set out to influence anyone. He didn't try to make Zen fashionable or trendy, yet his calm explanations became fuel for an artistic wildfire. The Beats took his ideas and made them noisy, vibrant, and alive. They were the opposite of monks, but their search was the same, to escape the tyranny of thought and reconnect with the immediacy of existence. Suzuki had given them the philosophical foundation to justify that pursuit. The intellectual establishment, meanwhile, didn't quite know what to make of it. Critics dismissed the Beats as chaotic, undisciplined, even immoral. But what those critics missed was that the chaos was deliberate. It was a form of honesty. In a world obsessed with control, the Beats were letting go. That act of surrender, the core of Zen practice, was radical in itself. And though many of them misunderstood the depth of Suzuki's teachings, their enthusiasm carried Zen far beyond academia. By the late 1950s, Zen had become a cultural phenomenon. It was in art galleries, jazz clubs, and poetry readings. Musicians like John Cage drew directly from Suzuki's lectures, exploring silence as a form of expression. Cage's famous piece, 433, where the musician plays nothing and the audience listens to the ambient sounds of the room, is pure Zen. It asks the listener to notice what's already there. Without Suzuki, that idea might never have reached Western art in such a profound way. Suzuki had once written that Zen cannot be understood intellectually, it must be lived. The Beat generation tried to live it, even if they stumbled along the way. Their road trips, their poems, their chaotic gatherings, all were attempts to find the truth Suzuki spoke of. They took his calm stillness and turned it into a storm, but the essence was the same: awareness, presence, and authenticity. Through Suzuki, the Beats discovered that spirituality didn't have to be solemn. It could be wild, poetic, and full of contradictions. It could exist in a jazz solo, a long drive through the night, or a shared moment of silence between strangers. That realization changed not just literature, but the way an entire culture thought about consciousness. And while Suzuki never sought disciples, he became, unintentionally, the quiet center of a loud revolution. His words echoed through typewriters and across coffee-stained tables, shaping the minds of people who would go on to redefine what it meant to be free. When D.T. Suzuki began writing about Zen, his goal wasn't to change psychology or Western philosophy. He was simply trying to communicate the essence of something deeply human, awareness itself. Yet over time, his ideas would reach the minds of some of the most influential psychologists and philosophers of the 20th century, who were beginning to question what it really meant to be conscious. The West had long treated the human mind as a machine to be analyzed, dissected, and fixed. Suzuki, in contrast, presented it as something to be understood through direct experience, not theory. That small shift from analyzing the mind to observing it became the spark that lit a quiet revolution in modern psychology. To understand Suzuki's impact, imagine the post-war intellectual scene. Psychoanalysis, shaped by Freud, still dominated Western psychology. It saw the mind as a battlefield of unconscious desires, trauma, and repression. The therapist's job was to bring the hidden into light, to interpret the symbols of dreams, and to decode human suffering through logic and dialogue. But there was a growing sense of limitation. Even as therapy became more common, people still felt disconnected from themselves, from others, from meaning. Something was missing. When Suzuki's works began circulating among Western thinkers, they presented a radically different way of seeing the mind. He described consciousness not as a set of competing forces, but as a flowing, living process. Zen, he wrote, is not about fixing the mind, but about realizing that there was never anything broken in the first place. This struck a chord with humanist psychologists like Erich Fromm, who had already started to question Freud's narrow focus on pathology. Fromm believed that human beings suffered not just from repressed desires, but from alienation, from the loss of connection with life itself. Fromm first encountered Suzuki's work in the late 1940s and was immediately fascinated. The two met in 1957 at a symposium in Mexico that would later become legendary among scholars. There, Suzuki presented Zen not as a mystical or religious system, but as a form of psychological insight. He explained that the mind's endless chatter, the internal narration that constantly labels, judges, and categorizes, is the root of human suffering. Fromm, who was studying how modern capitalism and social conformity shape the human psyche, recognized the connection instantly. Both men were pointing to the same problem: the modern person's loss of authentic being. Fromm described the average Western mind as trapped in having rather than being. We define ourselves by possessions, achievements, and opinions. Suzuki's Zen, on the other hand, invited a state of pure being, where identity is not built around what we own or think, but around simple presence. That idea deeply influenced Fromm's later writings, particularly The Art of Being, where he proposed that true psychological health comes from non-attachment and awareness, direct echoes of Zen philosophy. But Suzuki's influence didn't stop there. It quietly began shaping the development of existential and humanistic psychology. Thinkers like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow started to focus less on diagnosing mental illness and more on realizing human potential. Maslow's concept of self-actualization, often seen as a cornerstone of positive psychology, shares striking parallels with Zen's idea of awakening. Both reject the notion that fulfillment comes from external achievement. Instead, they point inward. The process of growth in both systems is about removing illusion, peeling away false identities until only raw awareness remains. Suzuki's writings also caught the attention of philosophers who were struggling to reconcile science with spirituality. In the West, philosophy had become analytical, obsessed with logic, language, and systems of thought. Suzuki disrupted that framework entirely. He said that enlightenment doesn't come from thinking about truth, it comes from direct perception. For a philosopher trained to analyze ideas, that was almost heresy. Yet it fascinated them. Heidegger's later explorations of being and nothingness were often compared to Zen thought, and though there's no evidence that Suzuki directly influenced him, both were responding to the same question. What happens when thinking itself becomes an obstacle to understanding? One of Suzuki's most profound impacts came decades later, long after his death, in the rise of mindfulness-based therapies. These therapies, now used around the world to treat anxiety, depression, and trauma, can trace their intellectual lineage back to the bridge Suzuki built between Eastern introspection and Western psychology. Mindfulness, in its simplest form, is the practice of observing one's thoughts without judgment, exactly what Suzuki described when he explained Zen awareness. He wrote that when you watch your thoughts like passing clouds, you begin to see that the mind is not a storm but the sky itself. In the 1970s, Jon Kabat-Zinn developed mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, a clinical method rooted in Buddhist meditation, yet stripped of religious language. Kabat-Zinn himself acknowledged that his understanding of mindfulness grew from the Zen and Vipassana traditions that Suzuki had helped popularize. His work transformed what had once been monastic practice into mainstream medicine. Today, mindfulness is not just therapy, it's an industry. Millions practice it to manage stress, improve focus, or find peace. Yet the heart of it, the ability to watch the mind without clinging to it, remains pure Zen. What Suzuki achieved was more than translation. He gave Western psychology a new vocabulary for understanding consciousness. Before him, words like emptiness, no mind, and enlightenment were alien to Western discourse. He reframed them in psychological terms. Emptiness, for instance, was not a void but a state of openness, the absence of mental clutter that allows genuine perception. No mind didn't mean lack of awareness, it meant freedom from the tyranny of overthinking. In doing so, he made centuries of Eastern insight accessible to scientists, therapists, and philosophers who would have otherwise dismissed it as mysticism. One of the most important shifts Suzuki initiated was the movement from dualism to integration. Western thought had long separated mind and body, self and world, subject and object. Zen collapses those divisions. Suzuki illustrated this with simple metaphors. A painter doesn't paint a mountain, he becomes the mountain. A swordsman doesn't strike with thought, he moves as the sword itself. In psychological terms, this means that awareness is not something the self has, it is the self. The observer and the observed are one. That insight reshaped later developments in Gestalt therapy, which emphasized holistic awareness and the unity of experience. Even modern neuroscience owes something to Suzuki's legacy. The current fascination with neuroplasticity and the effects of meditation on the brain began when researchers noticed that practices like mindfulness could physically rewire neural pathways. The idea that thought and awareness could reshape biology was revolutionary, but Suzuki had already hinted at it decades earlier. He wrote that the mind is not a fixed entity but a living process, one that changes as awareness deepens. What neuroscience now measures in MRI scans, Suzuki described through metaphor and introspection. His influence also extended into Western philosophy of mind. Scholars like Alan Watts, who became one of the most famous interpreters of Eastern philosophy, directly built upon Suzuki's translations. Watts often said that Suzuki opened the door for him, that without Suzuki, Zen would have remained a distant curiosity rather than a living philosophy. Through Watts and others, Suzuki's ideas filtered into universities, art schools, and even countercultural movements. By the 1960s, concepts like ego death and the present moment were everywhere, from psychedelic research to the human potential movement. Few realized that their roots traced back to the quiet scholar who wrote essays about Zen practice in the early 1900s. Perhaps the most profound consequence of Suzuki's bridge building was the transformation of how the West understood suffering itself. In the Freudian model, suffering was a symptom to be analyzed, something to be eliminated. In the Zen view, suffering is part of existence, not to be destroyed but to be seen clearly. Awareness, Suzuki taught, does not fix pain, it transforms the relationship to it. When modern therapists encourage patients to sit with discomfort instead of fighting it, they are echoing that same principle. This shift, from curing to understanding, lies at the heart of today's most successful psychological methods. In many ways, Suzuki reintroduced the West to something it had forgotten, the wisdom of stillness. He didn't reject science or reason, but he reminded thinkers that logic can only go so far. Beyond analysis lies awareness, something no amount of theory can replace. His writings showed that enlightenment wasn't an exotic state reserved for monks. It was a psychological reality accessible to anyone who could truly observe their own mind. D.T. Suzuki's genius was subtle. He didn't build temples or found a movement. He simply translated silence into language. Yet that act, so simple, so quiet, altered the trajectory of Western thought. His bridge between Zen and psychology continues to shape how people everywhere understand themselves, their thoughts, and their search for peace. What began as a few essays written by an old professor became the foundation for one of the most powerful shifts in modern consciousness, a shift that continues every time someone sits, breathes, and notices their own mind without judgment. In the final years of his life, D.T. Suzuki lived quietly in Japan, surrounded by books, visitors, and the slow rhythm of his own breath. Yet his words were already echoing across the world. The young minds he had influenced, writers, artists, philosophers, and psychologists, were carrying his message into classrooms, therapy rooms, and meditation halls. Suzuki's true legacy was not confined to the monasteries of Kyoto or the lecture halls of Columbia University. It was in the idea that peace, the kind monks cultivated for centuries behind temple walls, could be found in the chaos of ordinary life. He taught that you didn't have to escape the world to find calm. You had to escape the illusion that calm depended on the world being quiet. Suzuki called this direct realization satori, a flash of insight that cuts through the mental noise. He said it doesn't come from years of study or piles of books, but from a sudden moment of seeing things as they are. For him, enlightenment wasn't some grand cosmic revelation. It was practical, immediate, and utterly human. A person washing dishes could experience it as easily as a monk meditating under a pine tree. All it required was total attention, a mind not wandering in past regrets or future worries, but resting fully in the act itself. This was Suzuki's revolution, to show that awakening was not hidden in mystery, but woven into the fabric of ordinary living. When he spoke of peace, he didn't describe it as the absence of conflict or the bliss of retreat. He described it as clarity, the peace that comes from seeing life without distortion, without the mental labels that divide experiences into good and bad. Suzuki wrote that most human suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our resistance to them. We cling to what we like, we reject what we hate, and in doing so we build a cage around the mind. Zen practice, as he taught it, was the art of dismantling that cage. By observing thoughts and sensations without judgment, one becomes free. Not because life becomes easier, but because the mind stops fighting it. He often used simple, vivid examples to explain this. If you hear a dog barking, the untrained mind reacts with irritation. It labels the sound as noise, wishes it away, and loses peace in the process. But a quiet mind hears the same sound as it is, just sound, nothing more. The difference lies not in the world, but in awareness. In that space between stimulus and reaction lies freedom. Suzuki's teaching was that anyone, anywhere, could find that space. You didn't need a monastery, you needed mindfulness. You didn't need robes, you needed patience. This insight, though ancient, became radically modern in Suzuki's hands. He understood that the modern person's temple was not a mountain hermitage, but the office, the train station, or the kitchen sink. The post-war world was speeding up. Industrialization, consumerism, constant motion. People were busier than ever and emptier than ever. Suzuki's message arrived like a quiet antidote. He offered not escape, but transformation. Instead of running from the noise, he taught people how to listen to it differently. Instead of chasing more experiences, he invited them to experience one moment completely. Many who encountered Suzuki's work described it as life-changing, not because it gave them answers, but because it stripped away their questions. Zen, he said, is not about adding anything to your life. It's about removing what doesn't belong. The mind's endless chatter, its stories, fears, and desires, creates a fog that hides reality. When that fog lifts, even for an instant, the simplest things become profound. The sound of rain, the feeling of breath, the warmth of sunlight. For Suzuki, this wasn't poetic exaggeration, it was enlightenment itself. The great irony was that Suzuki never tried to become a spiritual celebrity. He didn't build a movement or claim followers. He was, by nature, a scholar, soft-spoken, disciplined, humble. But his calm presence and simple language made complex truths accessible. To his students, he embodied the peace he described. He didn't preach detachment as an escape from life's messiness. He demonstrated engagement without entanglement. When asked how to find enlightenment, he would often smile and say, "When you are hungry, eat. When you are tired, sleep." It sounded too simple, but that simplicity was the point. The ordinary, when seen clearly, is extraordinary. Suzuki's legacy also transformed how people in the West approached knowledge itself. He showed that wisdom is not accumulation, it's subtraction. Western education trains the mind to add, to gather data, build arguments, master concepts. Zen does the opposite. It teaches the art of unlearning, of returning to a beginner's mind. Suzuki used to say that the beginner sees many possibilities while the expert sees few. The beginner's mind is open, curious, free from preconceptions. That state of openness, he believed, was the birthplace of creativity and insight. His influence can still be felt in the fields of design, art, and even business philosophy, where the idea of simplicity has become a guiding principle. If you trace the roots of mindfulness practices in schools, hospitals, or corporations today, they all lead back to Suzuki's bridge between East and West. His way of presenting Zen, free of superstition, focused on experience, made it acceptable to scientists and doctors. Decades after his death, neuroscientists would confirm what he already knew intuitively. that stillness changes the brain, that awareness reshapes perception. But Suzuki didn't need an fMRI to see this truth. He saw it in the way a person's face softened after sitting in silence, or in how anger dissolved when someone finally saw their thoughts as just thoughts. His teaching of Satori, the flash of awakening, was not reserved for monks or scholars. He insisted that anyone could experience it because everyone already had the nature of enlightenment within them. He described it as waking up from a dream you didn't know you were dreaming. It could happen while chopping vegetables or while staring at a sunset. The key was presence. The mind, when it stops grasping and resisting, becomes transparent. And through that transparency, reality shines. Even in his later years, Suzuki remained focused on practice, not theory. When asked how to achieve enlightenment, he warned against the obsession with achieving. He said that the more one tries to force enlightenment, the further it goes. True understanding comes not by effort, but by letting go. Like a still pond reflecting the moon, the mind must become quiet to see truth clearly. That image, the still pond, the reflected moon, has since become one of the most enduring metaphors of Zen, appearing in countless modern interpretations of mindfulness and meditation. Suzuki's impact can be seen not only in psychology and spirituality, but in the quiet confidence of those who learn to live without constant reaction. His message continues to resonate in a world that grows louder every year. Technology, social media, and endless distraction have made silence feel rare and uncomfortable. Yet his teaching remains the same. Peace is not out there, it's here, underneath the noise. When you stop running toward calm and simply stop running, you find it waiting where it always was. He taught that life is not a problem to solve, but a reality to experience. Every moment, painful or joyful, is complete in itself. The task is not to escape suffering, but to meet it fully. This radical acceptance doesn't make life easier, but it makes it real. In that reality, peace arises naturally. That is the practical peace Suzuki offered to the world, the ability to live fully awake wherever you are. So when you see meditation apps, mindfulness programs, or quiet retreats promising transformation, remember that their roots trace back to a soft-spoken professor who taught that enlightenment begins with awareness of a single breath. D.T. Suzuki didn't just teach Zen, he translated it into life itself. His legacy is not found in temples or books, but in every person who pauses, breathes, and realizes that the world, just as it is enough. And if you found meaning in this story of the man who brought silence to a noisy world, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need a little stillness today, and subscribe to The Fictionist for more stories where philosophy meets the pulse of real life.